Of course, there are many reasons to spend a month studying in London. London offers hundreds of years of history embodied in historical landmarks like the icon of English identity, St. Paul's Cathedral, or the magnificent Tower Bridge, or even the classical Parliament building overlooking the Thames River. Then there are the new and modern buildings like the Gherkin, illustrating the development of London into the 20th and 21st centuries, as well as the juxtapositions that are present throughout the city and various communities. And who could leave out the numerous famous London tourist attractions like the London Eye, Big Ben, and the Millennium Bridge. But I would argue that other major cities have just as much history, modernism, and tourist attractions. Growing up in New York City, I'm used to seeing historically landmarked neighborhoods and old historic churches everywhere I look. We have plenty of modern skyscraping buildings and our fair share of tourist attractions to add on to that. But still, there is something that I found more valuable than all of these things that only London can offer, and that is a variety of accessible art. Now I know what you must be thinking. New York is also well known for its plethora of world-famous museums, including a range of historical and science museums, and a long list of small museums and art galleries. But consider this. As an art lover and artist myself, I thrive on visits to the museums. Yet, why is it that I have visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art countless times, and yet I could fit the number of times I've visited the Museum of Modern Art on one hand? And what's the answer? Money. The Met is free with suggested donation, whereas for an adult to enter the MoMA, it's $20. Now, of course, they offer a student discount, which cuts the price down to $12. I don't know about you guys, but I can't afford that on a regular basis. And this is the story with many of the big museums in major cities, but not in London. In London, all national museums are free. In my month in London, I visited the National Gallery, the Tate Modern, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Museum, the John Sloan Museum, the Docklands Museum, the Museum of London, and the list just goes on and on. And how much did it cost me, in total, to see this list of a dozen or so museums? Nothing. Now maybe you're thinking there's some catch, right? Like maybe they're all art museums, or maybe they're all history museums, or maybe they all have really similar collections. Well, you're wrong.
Not only are the museums accessible in London, but there is a huge variety of art and history displayed in them. In this presentation, I will focus on just a few of the many museums I visited, just to give you an idea of the range of exhibitions available for viewing in London. I will briefly discuss the Tate Modern, the Museum of London, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as the British Museum. The first one I will discuss is the Tate Modern, probably because it's my favorite. The Tate Modern shows a range of types of modern artwork from various mediums, including sculpture, painting, and even large-scale installations. As you can see, there's a variety of artists showcased, including Jean Moreau, Diego Rivera, and more well-known artists like Jeff Koons, and of course, the well-known Andy Warhol. The Tate Modern is an art gallery, not necessarily in the more traditional sense, like the National Gallery or the Tate Britain, but it does showcase artists' work rather than a historical museum or a science museum. Now let's take a look at a historical museum. The Museum of London is a history museum located right near the city centre of London. On the day that I visited it, it included an exhibit on South Africa and their struggle for freedom, as well as an exhibit on the Great Fire of London, which happened in 1666. And now let's leave the Museum of London and move back to looking at another art museum. The Victoria and Albert Museum was probably another one of my favorite museums that I visited while in London. It is also an art museum, but it includes a huge range of different types of exhibitions. When I first entered the museum, I was most excited to see a wing of Romanesque and Greek-like classical sculptures in marble. These are one of my favorite types of art and one of my favorite periods of art, and it was wonderful to walk around the room and have these marble sculptures towering over you. But this wasn't the only kind of exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. There was also a fashion wing where they exhibited period dresses from different influential figures representing different cities and different styles throughout time. But probably my favorite exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum when I visited this past month was the Telling Tales exhibit, Fantasy and Fear in Contemporary Design. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to take pictures in this exhibit, but it showcased several specific rooms or wings where furniture was modeled after various themes and people in fairy tales. And the entire exhibition was decorated, and each time you walked into a room, you really felt like you were in that part of a fairy tale. There was other exhibitions about fairy tales throughout the museum, including a few little side didactics. And now for the last museum that I will discuss in this presentation, the British Museum. Probably most well known for its historical elements, like the Rosetta Stone or the Parthenon friezes. The British Museum is somewhat of a cross between an art museum and historical museum. With a wing representing almost every continent, the British Museum is one of the largest museums in London. It could probably take one person 8 hours or a whole full day to wander into every single wing in the museum. So I didn't try to do that. Instead, I found myself again drawn to the Greek marble sculptures and statues. But there is one important thing to note about the British Museum, is that another thing that is very famous for is its reading room, which has had many authors throughout time spend time there, including Virginia Woolf and George Eliot. The contents of the reading room are now located in the British Library. And this brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. We have looked at the ways that London offers something that even New York City can't offer, and that is accessible museums. I've walked you through a few of the most influential museums that I visited while in London, which were the Tate Modern, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Museum of London, and the British Museum. I found that these 4 museums best exemplified the range of artwork and historical artifacts available for free for everyone, people of all ages, classes, and economical backgrounds in London. And that's why I would recommend spending a month studying abroad in London and appreciating art for everyone.